Day. Yesterday, I started my program by referencing a roundup of about 25 people in Germany who are being accused of plotting a coup against the German government. I said in that program that I would wait until a little more information was provided before offering my views. Well, I don't have the full story, and I don't think anybody outside the law enforcement agencies and the persons arrested and their lawyers has anything like the whole story. But I'm going to offer my own preliminary and very brief views. Firstly, I want to just reiterate an important point which much reporting of this incident or alleged incident disregards. This is that anybody accused of a crime is presumed innocent until proved guilty following a trial before a properly constituted court of law. That is a fundamental legal principle. People who are now talking about this coup as something which actually was being prepared perhaps are overlooking that. Secondly, I'm going to say straightforwardly that I don't believe anything about this allegation that there was a coup. I am completely disbelieving of the official account of this whole affair. Allegedly, 25 people were involved, or at least have been arrested. I cannot imagine the 25 individuals, some of them fairly elderly, can conceivably have imagined that they could single-handedly overthrow the government of Germany. Many of them are previous veterans of law enforcement and security agencies in Germany. Some of them held high positions in some of these agencies. But it's clear that they're not serving officers. They do not command or control any of these agencies any longer. And I cannot believe that these people, veterans of these sort of organizations, familiar therefore with security issues, could have imagined that they could single-handedly carry out a coup of the sort that's been alleged just by themselves without being able to gain support from the institutions of the German state in order to sort of back this coup up. I suspect that a number of people were talking together, bitterly lamenting the direction the German policy has been taking over the last few months, perhaps years. I think that this is a fairly widespread view amongst people of this kind in Germany. There's always been, if you like, a kind of Prussian opinion about what the proper direction of German policy should be, a Bismarckian one if you prefer. I suspect that these people lament Germany's involvement in the war in Ukraine, the rupture of relations with Russia, and the extent to which Germany today seems to be subordinating its policies, as they would see it, to those of the United States, the European Union, and NATO. But I suspect it did not go beyond talk. Perhaps there was some talk of a protest at the Reichstag building in Berlin, but I cannot for the life of me imagine that these people were planning or plotting or intending to carry out any sort of coup. It doesn't help that there's suggestions from the German authorities that these people were looking to try to not just overthrow the German government, but were hoping to get support from other governments and even NATO governments, which seems crazy, and I don't believe these people are crazy. But of course, it's been alleged that the government that they were hoping to win over was that of Russia. And again, these people are far too experienced and far too knowledgeable to have seriously believed, or so it seems to me, that the Russian authorities would have any time or give any support to a madcap venture like this, which was certain to fail. It doesn't help that though one particular person who's identified as Russian A woman is supposed to have been in contact with these people. She's given a male first name, or so it seems to me, which does make one wonder about exactly who this person is. And even the German authorities are admitting that the Russians, in no sense, authorized or had any time for this affair. So, to my mind, what this episode shows is the nervousness of the German authorities, the fact that there are lots of criticisms, including within parts of the German establishment, about the policies that the German government has been following, and that perhaps taking their cue from some of the things that have been happening over the last 2 years in the United States, the German authorities are taking preemptive action. So that's my view. Obviously, we only have a very limited amount of information up to now. I'm not going to devote more time to this affair. I'll be following it closely. However, I would say that for a government to talk about a coup being plotted against itself is inevitably going to create nervousness and even instability within a country. And I would have thought that Germany, of all places, would want to avoid that. But there we are. That's the information. That's my opinion. People I've spoken to who are either German or in Germany seem to share the same view of this bizarre affair as I have. That's all I'm going to say about it for the moment, but I do anticipate that I will be returning to this topic in the future. Let me repeat again, these are my opinions, and obviously there are only limited numbers of facts available at the moment. Let us return now to the big topic, the one which explains all the stresses and nervousness and worries that exist in the world, and that, of course, is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been more reports of more Russian advances in Ukraine, a place which is called, I believe it's called Yakovinka, but I may be getting the name wrong, and if I am, apologies. That's also been captured by the Russians. We're back, by the way, to the situation we had in the first months of the war, up to August, when no day seemed to pass without the Russians reporting an advance and the capture of at least one settlement. We seem to be reverting to that situation. The Russians do seem to be now on the advance everywhere on the front lines in Donbass. And there's an accumulation of reports now that the Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv are becoming increasingly worried, that they're seeing clear signs of the Russians preparing some kind of offensive operation in Kharkiv, perhaps to attack and recapture Kupiansk, perhaps to return Russian forces to the Oskol river line, perhaps to advance even further and retake Izium. Of course, all of this is speculative. We don't know what the Russians are planning in this area, but Patrick Lancaster, who we interviewed in a live stream on the Duran last week, also reported that there are Russian advances in this area, and it does seem as if the balance of forces in the northern Donbass, Kharkiv region has turned. By the way, an official of the Lugansk People's Republic also said as much, and it does seem that the Russians are once more gaining the initiative in this area and are taking the battle increasingly to Ukraine and are no longer just defending. So that's what's going on in that part of the fighting. And there's also been more reports of more Russian advances in Donetsk, of attempts by Ukraine to retake positions near Vuhledar, Pavlovka and all the rest, having been repulsed, with the Ukrainians suffering heavy losses. But of course, the main fight, the main battle continues to be in and around Bakhmut. And we're getting more and more reports about the scale of Ukrainian losses in this area. Now, a ex-US military officer, a US Navy colonel, I presume that means a former Marine colonel, Andrew Milburn, who has been trying to set up an organization to parallel and match the Wagner organization, which the Russians have deployed in Ukraine. He is reported to have said that, or rather to have confirmed that Ukraine is indeed suffering very heavy losses in this area. He apparently has said, I haven't seen the video in which he's reported to have said these things, that reports about Ukrainian units suffering 70% losses are not an exaggeration. And he also is reported to have said that Ukrainian troops thrown into combat, presumably in this area of Bakhmut, the fact that they have little beyond basic training is also true. By the way, General Surovikin, in that interview he gave on Russian television, I think it was about 2 months ago now, said the same thing, that Ukrainian troops that are being thrown into battle, their levels of training are very low, those who have been called up, and of course that is increasing the scale of their losses. It's been pointed out now by a number of people, including people who've been in touch with me, that the reported losses Ukraine is suffering in the Bakhmut area, by some Western accounts, by Ukrainian accounts, up to 800 dead and wounded a day in Bakhmut. That is the equivalent of a battalion every day. In other words, Ukraine is losing a battalion every day trying to defend Bakhmut. Now, of course, not all of these people are killed. Most of these people are wounded. They're sent back. They're treated. But of course, I discussed this long piece by John Helmer yesterday in his website, Dancing with Bears, about the essential collapse of the Ukrainian medical services, the immense difficulties, the immense stresses that they are under, and their increasing difficulties in caring for Ukrainian wounded soldiers properly. It's a harrowing series of reports, very distressing, but I have to say all the reports I'm getting from Bakhmut City describing what the Ukrainian defenders there are experiencing, well, all of them now are extremely harrowing, and even some of the photographs which give pictures of a devastated landscape with comparisons being made of Verdun and Ypres during the First World War. Well, some of these pictures have been circulating in the Western media, though in my opinion they're not being given anything like the kind of attention that they merit. Meanwhile, there's been a very interesting article in Newsweek. Now, I should say that this article came out on the 6th of December. I've only, however, recently read it, so it's now two days old. But it is written by two people who have a background, an interesting background in assessing these sort of things. One of them is David H. Rundle, who is a former chief of mission at the American Embassy in Saudi Arabia, and the author of a book, Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. Another is Ambassador Michael Kverler, a former political advisor to the US Central Command, and he served for 15 years in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. Now, these two persons, who, to my mind, I don't know anything else about their backgrounds other than these brief bios, but it strongly suggests that either they are former intelligence officers, or if they are diplomats, which they may be. They are people who have handled and assessed intelligence and who are very well informed about these matters. Anyway, these people have published this article in Newsweek, and I found it extraordinarily interesting because it directly, flatly contradicts the official narrative, one propounded by people recently, like the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. It directly contradicts that, and it sets a very different perspective of the war. Now, this is an open publication article. I'm going to read extracts from it, and I'm going to provide a link. It's a very interesting article, and I'm going to say this: contrary to the account of the war that DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Haines, gave a couple of days ago, this article seems to me to be fully consistent with the reports I am getting about the actual situation on the battlefields in Ukraine. Now, the article starts with the words, "Lessons from the US Civil War show why Ukraine can't win." And I myself, in the past, have made certain comparisons between the war that is being fought in Ukraine today and the conduct of the American Civil War in the 1860s. That's, by the way, just about the only war that I have ever studied in any great detail. But I think that comparisons between that war and the current one in Ukraine are indeed valid. And these two authors think the same thing. And now I'm not going to read the whole article, but I'm going to read what for me are the relevant parts of it. And it says the following: during the early years of America's Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln sought a limited conflict against people he still regarded as fellow countrymen and with whom he sought reconciliation. Only after 3 years of stalemate did he turn to unconditional surrender grant. Those words are in quotation marks. General U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who of course famously at the Battle of Vicksburg came up with a demand for unconditional surrender from the Confederate officer who was defending Vicksburg. Anyway, unconditional surrender Grant, who in turn unleashed General William Tecumseh Sherman to make Georgia howl and help bring the war to its decisively violent conclusion. And the article then goes on to say Russian President Vladimir Putin waited only 6 months before switching from a special military operation to full-scale war against Ukraine. Putin's initial assault was limited to barely 150,000 troops. He expected a quick victory followed by negotiations on his principal concerns: Russian control of Crimea, Ukrainian neutrality, and autonomy for the Russian population in the Donbass. But he was wrong. Putin had not counted on Ukraine's stiff resistance or the West's massive military and economic situation. Faced with a new situation, Putin changed his strategy. Now he's about to unleash his own General Sherman and make Ukraine howl. Now, I should say that I agree with this summary. Not in every detail. I think that these two authors skate over the fact that Putin's initial strategy, as he describes it, expecting a quick victory followed by negotiations on Russian control of Crimea, Ukrainian neutrality, autonomy for Donbass, well, actually independence for Donbass. As I've discussed multiple times, we came actually very close to achieving that in the Istanbul negotiations that took place at the end of March. So, I do want to throw in that qualifier, but in all other respects, I think this summary is basically right. And then it goes on to say this. Last month, Putin gave General Sergei Surovikin overall command of Russia's war in the Ukraine. Surovikin comes from the technologically sophisticated aerospace forces, but has fought on the ground in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and Syria, where he's credited with saving the Assad regime. Surovikin has stated publicly that there will be no half measures in Ukraine. He has begun to methodically destroy Ukraine's infrastructure with precision missile attacks. And well, we've been seeing all of this. And then the article continues. Armies need railroads, and whilst Sherman systematically tore up the tracks leading to Atlanta, Surovikin is destroying the electricity grid which powers Ukrainian railroads. I would add that with the weather getting colder, the Ukrainian energy agency Ukrenergo is now saying that the demands on the Ukrainian energy system are becoming greater, even as the damage is also getting greater. And it looks as if the energy system, is going to be under even more strain than Ukrenergo was saying a few days ago. Anyway, to continue. We continue with the article. That's to say, the missile attacks on the electricity grid, which powers the Ukrainian railroads, has left Ukrainian cities cold and dark, but Surovikin seems to agree with Sherman that war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. Well, I've discussed all of that before. I've also said that you may start a war with the best of intentions. You may say to yourself that you're going to exercise restraint, but the imperative of avoiding defeat, the imperative of achieving victory, if your opponent resists, will inevitably push you towards more and more ruthless measures. We saw that in the American Civil War, as this article says, and as this article also says, we see that with the action the Russians have taken. And then we continue to read what the article says. Russia has now put its economy on a war footing, called up the reserves and assembled hundreds of thousands of troops. And we've had more information about that from Putin himself, and I will come to that shortly. Assembled hundreds of thousands of troops, including both conscripts and volunteers. Not conscripts, actually, but reservists, but we will let that pass. The army is equipped with Russia's most sophisticated weapons, and contrary to much Western reporting, and by the way, what Director of National Intelligence Haynes has been telling people, it is far from, that's my insert, by the way, that's not in the article about Haynes, is far from demoralized. Ukraine, on the other hand, has exhausted its armories and is totally dependent on Western military support to continue the war. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley noted last week, Ukraine has done about all it can. Once Ukraine's rich black soil has firmly frozen, a massive Russian onslaught will commence. In fact, it has already begun at the important transportation hub of Bakhmut, which has become something of a Ukrainian Verdun, the First World War analogies that many are citing. We expect Bakhmut to fall and predict that without much more Western support, Russia will recapture Kharkiv. Well, they've never actually captured Kharkiv city, but I think they mean the territories in Kharkiv, Kherson, and the remainder of Donbass by next summer. And then the article goes on to make some really important points about the West's, the United States, overcommitment to Ukraine. I'm not going to read the whole entirety of this section. I'm going to provide a link to the article. You can read it all there for yourselves. But this is what the article goes on to say, as the West did in Vietnam, Afghanistan and Iraq, we are stumbling into another optional open-ended military commitment. Ukrainian troops are being trained in Europe. Western defense contractors are already maintaining Ukrainian military equipment and operating the HIMARS missile system. That's an interesting throwaway comment, by the way. Western contractors are operating the HIMARS missile system. Just say, active duty American military personnel are now in Ukraine to monitor weapons deliveries. As the Russian offensive gains momentum, we expect loud voices to call for sending ever more advanced weapons and eventually NATO boots on the ground to defend Ukraine. And then the paragraph goes on to say these voices should be unambiguously rejected for many reasons. And then it goes through a list of those reasons. I'm not going to go over them. It is an important part of the article. In fact, it is a vitally important part of the article. But I'm going to focus on what it is saying about the current military situation. And, well, those were the key paragraphs, but I would not be fair in my reporting of this article if I didn't also mention the important qualifier in the last paragraph, which in describing the military situation says, perhaps we are wrong. Perhaps there will not be a Russian winter offensive, or perhaps the Ukrainian armed forces will be able to stop it. However, if we are correct, and February finds General Surovikin at the gates of Kiev, we need to have soberly considered and honestly debated as a nation and an alliance the extent of our commitment to Ukraine and what risks we are willing to accept to our own security. And I am entirely in agreement with all of that. I would add to this article a point which the article does not make, but which I think is implicit in it, which is the devastation that has been done to Ukraine and the appalling suffering of the Ukrainian soldiers in places like Bakhmut, which I talked about in many programs and which I've touched on briefly in this video. Now, that's an article from these two former retired American officials in Newsweek. And it is consistent with the sort of comments that are also being made by other former intelligence officers. Now, recently, I did a program with Glenn Deason. Glenn Deason, by the way, I want to make it very clear, was the host of that program. For some strange reason, people seem to think that I was, but it was Glenn Deason who was the host. Anyway, Ray McGovern was there, former top analyst of the CIA, person who gave the president, Ronald Reagan, his daily brief, person who understands war to an extent that I cannot, person who understands intelligence and who's actually handled raw intelligence. And he gives his clear view about the situation in Ukraine and the military situation, or so it seems to me. I don't think I'm distorting his words in any way or his opinions in any way. Well, I think it is very much in accord with what these two people who've written this article for Newsweek are saying. And Larry Johnson, by the way, has also made points about the war. And I've noticed that he too, for example, is now making comparisons between the situation Ukraine is in and the American Civil War. Now, Larry Johnson, also ex-CIA veteran, also somebody who's handled intelligence, which is something which I, by the way, have never done, raw intelligence, but he's talked about the devastation that Ukraine is suffering, the fact that the losses Ukraine is suffering, that they bear some resemblance to what was happening in the war in the American Civil War. The losses that the Ukrainians are suffering are analogous to those inflicted by General Grant upon Ukraine over the course of 1864, and which resulted ultimately in Ukraine's military defeat. So we see intelligence officers, retired intelligence officers, people who perhaps don't always agree with each other and who may have very different perspectives of things. I mean, I know Larry Johnson, I know Ray McGovern individually. I don't know what opinions either person has about the other. I'm not going there. All I am saying is these two people who, by the way, unlike many of these intelligence officials, White House officials who brief the media, McGovern, Johnson, the two people who've written this article for Newsweek, who may, of course, not be former intelligence officers, I don't know, but all of them are going out publicly on the record. They're telling us what they think. They're explaining the reasons why they think what they do. And I think we should take them seriously. Now, and as I've said already, it is consistent with the reports I'm getting about the situation on the battlefields from both Russian and, by the way, Ukrainian sources. Now, I do wonder whether this article that's appeared in Newsweek, and this is a guess, and, again, I don't want to force my opinions here on people or perhaps misrepresent things. I misrepresent the intentions of the authors of this article. But I wonder whether perhaps it is intended as a response to this view about the state of the war that Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines was giving, that the situation on the battle lines has now reached some kind of reduction in the tempo. As I've said previously, how can the loss by Ukraine of the equivalent of a battalion every day, how is that equivalent with a reduction in the tempo? I mean, I don't understand that. I mean, I cannot comprehend what that even means. But anyway, she talks about a loss in the tempo. She talks about the Russians having all of these various problems. She talks about demoralization, Russian troops being demoralized, all of those kind of things. I wonder whether there's some kind of an argument within the intelligence agencies of the United States going on. Larry Johnson has spoken about a major problem with US intelligence. He suggested that US intelligence, instead of getting information or collecting information itself, is now depending far too much on its allies, Britain, Poland, perhaps Ukraine itself, to collect and analyze information for it. And that may explain why so many misconceptions about the situation on the battlefields exists. I'm just reporting that seems to be very likely. But I wonder whether Haines is coming out saying what she is saying, because more and more people within the US intelligence community are actually expressing their doubts, communicating doubts of the sort that the two authors of the Newsweek article have expressed, and which of course are consistent with the openly expressed views of retired persons like Larry Johnson, Ray McGovern, Scott Ritter, also an intelligence officer. Let us never forget all of those people. So maybe there is a debate going on, and it's very interesting again how these particular authors of that article for Newsweek are now warning against further US investment in Ukraine, how they're saying that under no circumstances should the United States do all of those things that they warn against, send more sophisticated weapons, send troops on the ground to Ukraine, try to somehow reverse the course of a losing war. Implicit in all of this is a recognition that there needs to be some kind of diplomatic process, very difficult now for reasons I'm going to come to try to bring this war to some kind of conclusion, even if from a Western point of view, it is going to be a very unsatisfactory one, with the Russians left in control of a great deal of what was once Ukraine, and with what is left of Ukraine devastated and broken, and quite likely also in time falling under Russian influence. But I'm not going to discuss this further in this program. I do wonder, however, whether in the subterranean depths of the American intelligence world, and perhaps amongst the military, it's interesting that the authors of that Newsweek article are referring to General Milley's comments about Ukraine having done all it can do, whether in fact that debate is now underway, and I do wonder whether Haynes's comments were some kind of an attempt to silence or close down that debate by restating publicly the orthodoxy. Well, we will see. What I will say is that we've now had observations about what is going to come in the war and about the nature of the mobilization from the top source in Russia, from President Putin himself. Now, Putin has just had a very big meeting with people of what used to be called his Human Rights Council, though it's now been very extensively reorganized. There was a lot of discussion about many things, and it's an interesting discussion in itself, and perhaps one that would merit its own program. One of the things that the various people over the course of that discussion discussed at great length, by the way, is the persistent shelling of Donetsk city by Ukraine, shelling which they say is indiscriminate. And, well, of course, Patrick Lancaster, who, again, we interviewed on a live stream a short time ago on the Duran, he's corroborated the fact that there is indeed shelling of Donetsk, ongoing shelling of Donetsk, and he has described some of the effects of that. Anyway, Putin and these people on this council were talking a great deal about that. They also talked about the way in which this shelling of Donetsk isn't discussed in the West, including by the various human rights agencies there. There was an interesting discussion. One doesn't have to accept what they all said about this issue. I'm not going to, again, discuss that in this program. But there were some things said about the nature of Russian military deployments, which I found interesting. And Putin spoke about the fact that there is no need for a further mobilization, that the mobilization he announced in September was going to be adequate for the needs of the war. But he actually said a great deal more, which he didn't need to say in order to make that point. And he talked about the nature of the troop deployments that are taking place. Now, he said this, and this is not an official translation, by the way, but, well, it is accurate enough, and it will do. These are Putin's words. Now, about the possible mobilization, further mobilization rumors on this score. Look, out of 300,000 mobilized, our fighters, our men, defenders of the fatherland, 150,000 are in the zone of the operation. 150,000, that is half, in the troops, in the grouping. Of these 150,000 in the group, only half, that's 77,000, are directly in combat units. The rest are on the second, third lines performing the functions, in fact, of the territorial defense troops, or undergo additional training in the zone of the operation. About 150,000, that is half of all mobilized citizens, are not in the group at all. They are still at the training grounds and in the training centres of the Ministry of Defence, where they receive additional training. If I can say so and call it that, it is the so-called combat reserve. Half of all mobilised, 150,000. Under these conditions, talk about some additional mobilisation measures simply does not make sense, and there is today no need for this, and the ministry, and so state the Ministry of Defence. And then Putin went on to talk about the duration of the war and the fact that there's been some people who are saying that it's going on for a very long time. And Putin said, I understand. As for the long process, of course, this is a long process, maybe, but then you mentioned that new territories have appeared. This is still a significant result for Russia and is a serious issue. And to be honest, the Sea of Azov has become the inland sea of the Russian Federation. These are serious things. And then he goes on to say Peter the Great, of course in Peter the First, was still struggling to reach the Sea of Azov. And the most important thing is the people who live in all these territories. Now, I'm going to come to what he says about the long duration of the war shortly. But the most interesting thing is what he says about all of these various troop deployments. Now, he says 77,000 men are now in combat units out of the 300,000 called up. 77,000 men. Now, I've discussed before how I believe that these are people who were previously, within a previous months or perhaps a year or so, who'd been serving as contract soldiers in the Russian army. Their contracts ran out. They went back into civilian life. They have been very recently in the military. They're young men, probably, most of them. They've been called back up and they've rejoined their units. They don't need a huge amount of training. And of course, 77,000 is already a very substantial reinforcement, and you can already see that they're making a difference. He then talks about the fact that there's another grouping, the rest of these, out of this, out of the 150,000 troops who are reservists, rather, who are already in the combat zones, they are in second and third lines either performing defense functions or receiving additional training. And these are the troops who are now probably going to man these very heavily fortified lines, who will also provide logistical functions, who will perhaps operate the artillery, the long-range artillery. They are the people who form the rear, who provide the base protection. And by the way, the Ukrainian military has said that the deployment of these 70,000 plus reservists, the second line reservists, has released more combat proficient units of the Russian military to join the Russian military on the front lines, and that has further enhanced the Russian forces, the strength of the Russian forces in Donbass. And as I said, we're already starting to see the effect of all of this. But it's what Putin said about the fact that there's another 150,000 men being held in reserve and who are still undergoing training that I found most interesting. I'll just repeat his words again. Another 150,000, that is half of all mobilized citizens, are not in the group at all. They are still at the training grounds and in the training centers of the Ministry of Defense, where they receive additional combat training. If I can say so and call it that, it is the so-called combat reserve. Half of all mobilized, 150,000. So, 150,000 men are being held back. They're being trained. To what purpose? Well, I am going to make a guess, and it's not here, just a guess, because there's actually been some reporting about this, and there's been some suggestions that these people, these additional reservists, to include officers, are being used to create new units, new tank and armored units. And this is indeed a powerful reserve force which is being built up. And I wonder to what end. And I'm going to suggest that this is a major armored punch. I talked in another program, I think, about the fact that the Russians in the past historically have had the operational doctrine of deep battle. The idea is you break the enemy's defenses on the front lines with infantry and artillery attacks, and then you send a major armored punch through the holes in the enemy's defenses that you've smashed and broken through, and that armored punch, that armored fist, is the one that is going to do the big advances. Is this what we're going to see? Is this what this force is all about? Possibly. I don't know. But it does give us some idea of the scale of the forces that are being built up and put together. So, we have a situation where Ukraine is losing the equivalent of a battalion every day in Bakhmut, where Ukraine is now on the defensive, both in southern Donbass, in and around Vuhledar, in places like Marinka and Avdiivka. By the way, I also saw a film on a Russian Telegram channel of Russian troops. I call them Russian troops. They may have been Donbass militia, I don't know. Also advancing steadily towards Avdiivka, capturing Ukrainian trenches, defending Avdiivka. They seem to be making progress there as well. We have information that the Russians are gradually regaining the initiative in Kharkiv region, in northern Lugansk and Donetsk region. And we also learn about the gathering crisis in the energy system, the interruption of the railways, the disruptions that this is causing to Ukraine's ability to move troops and supplies around Ukraine from one battlefront to another. And also, we hear increasingly about the depletion of Western armories, and we've had a very powerful warning from these two authors in Newsweek about the perils of overcommitment, of an overextended commitment to Ukraine, of the enormous dangers of sending boots on the ground and things of that sort. So, all the darkening picture for Ukraine, for its Western sponsors, and one I have to say that they have brought about and which they don't yet, and for the moment, seem to have any real rational response to. Well, I've discussed all of this in many programs. Again, I'm not going to return there. Now, this is the major topic. These are the major topics I wanted to discuss in this program. But before I end this program, I do want to return to an important topic, which was the missile strikes that Ukraine launched against the two big Russian air bases, Engels in Saratov region and the other base in Ryazan region. Now, I want to say that there were other Ukrainian attacks. There was a Ukrainian attack or attempted attack with drones on a base in Crimea on the following day. That was completely unsuccessful. All the drones were detected by the Russian air defenses and shot down long before they got to the base. I don't think, by the way, that they were these Tupolev Strij drones. And there was another attack on an air base in Kursk region. Now, I want to just touch on that one. I would say, first of all, that the airfield that was attacked in Kursk region is not a classic Soviet or Russian air base. It was an airfield which in the past has been used for both civilian and military purposes. So it's a civilian airfield which was also used for military purposes. Over the course of this conflict, the Russian military now has taken it over, but it doesn't have probably some of the elaborate defenses or that one would expect proper, military bases like, say, Engels to have. Now, I ought to say, if you travel around Russia, which I have done, one of the things you find is that many civilian airfields and airports actually do have this, to a Western eye, rather strange hybrid use. I've seen for myself how civilian airports in, say, a place like Perm in the Urals, where, civilian aircraft take on, pass and, travel through. Well, you find in a parking area not far from the main runway, you find, as I remember seeing, a whole row of MiG-31 fighter jets. It's not uncommon to see that in Russia. The Soviet Union, there wasn't quite the same rigid division between civilian and military air bases and airfields that you see in the West, that we have in the West. So Kursk was historically one of these hybrid bases. It's now, as I said, run by the military. It probably doesn't have the kind of elaborate defenses that other bases do. And the Ukrainian drone strike on it, which probably, I'm guessing, would not have used a Strij missile or drone, well, it hit some fuel tanks, but it doesn't seem to have done any significant damage. I would regard that attack by Ukraine as a failure. But coming back to the much more serious attacks on Engels, on the bases on the Engels base and on the base in Ryazan, I have now received an email from somebody who is unequivocally an expert authority on this issue. I mean, when I say an expert authority, I regard this email as authoritative and definitive. Now, the person who sent it is clearly an expert. It was a private email. I'm not going to read from it. I'm not going to disclose anything that I hope that might identify this person. What I will say is this. This person has made the point that Strij drones are actually quite sophisticated, that they're quite small, that they're not easy to detect at all. Certainly they would be very difficult to detect by ground radars, They can be detected by AWACS aircraft, and Russia does have some AWACS aircraft, though not in the numbers that NATO does. But this person pointed out that AWACS aircraft, the A-50 mainstay that the Russians use, it's probably been assigned to other locations, to perhaps the Belarus border, other places. And besides, you don't want to keep your AWACS aircraft flying all the time, because after a certain point, if you do that, they degrade. The crews get tired, the equipment deteriorates, all of those sort of things. And this person, who again, as I say, is an authoritative source, has pointed out to me that in fact the air defences at the bases worked, despite the fact that these Strij missiles were able to reach those bases. And as I said, he's pointed out that this is not quite as surprising as one might think, despite the long distances involved. This person has pointed out that the bases, the air defense systems at the bases worked and were able to shoot these two missiles or drones, these Strij missiles and drones, down before they did any significant and important damage. So that does give a very different perspective, or so it seems to me, to this attack. And it does suggest that in fact the Russians, perhaps their performance, their response to this was less unsuccessful, was more successful, was much more successful and effective than perhaps I suggested in my previous programs. Now, this person has said a lot more. I'm not going to discuss that because, even though it's interesting, but I fear that if I do get deeper into some of these things this person has said, I might be saying a bit too much, and I would repeat again, this was a private email. Anyway, I just pass all that on. So it does seem as if this was not perhaps quite the success for Ukraine as some people are suggesting, and as I might have suggested in my previous programs. And if so, and I'm sure that's right, then I stand corrected. Putin is certainly taking this very seriously. The Russians are certainly taking this very seriously. There was an unscheduled meeting of Russia's Security Council in the aftermath of these Ukrainian attempted missile strikes on these bases. And no doubt the Russians will be working out whatever precautions that they can take to respond to these sort of attacks in future. Well, with that, I end this program. As I said, we've been going on for almost an hour, and I'll be back with more programs soon. And I would like to say, first of all, that you can always find all of our programs on our other platforms, on Locals, on Rumble, on ODYSEE, on BitChute, on, of course, Rockfin, and on Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, you should also think about going to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, hats, all of those great things. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. No doubt there'll be more developments fairly soon, and more from me about those soon. And thank you for joining me again today for this program, and I look forward to having you all on my program again.